episode number 21 with Sarah Lloyd. Sarah, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How are you doing? How's the year for you? It's been a crazy couple of months here. We're about to go on another break, but everything been good?
Yeah, everything's really good. I think, I'm adjusting to hybrid teaching as well as anyone else is. So just kind of taking it day by day and trying to be empathetic to everyone else around to me too. So
yeah. It's crazy not seeing anyone in school, especially today. Like I walking down the hallways, no one was here on a Wednesday. But that part's been bizarre. But I think for my classes, the boys are doing pretty well virtually, which is shocking because it's so hard to pay attention on a screen, especially when you're doing it 3 times 70, every day of the week. But that's awesome. Maybe you can talk about what classes you teach here and really what you do at Gilman.
Yeah, so I'm in the history department, or I straddle the history and art department, depending on how you look at it. I teach 9th grade world cultures, I teach 11th grade U.S. history, and I also teach AP art history, which is a coordinated class too. So that's my teaching load. And then I also coach swimming and water polo at the upper school level. And I advise the Gender and Sexuality Alliance, or the GSA, as well.
Awesome. Teaching 3 different preps is not common. Most people don't have 3, if I'm correct on that, right?
Yeah, you're right.
You're one of very few teachers who teach 3 preps. So you're how did you start to do that so early on in your career, having to prepare for 3 different classes? I know that's very hard. I only have 2 and it's hard.
Yeah, I think so. I started with 9th grade world cultures as my first class when I was here for the first 2 years, and then last year they needed someone to teach U.S. history, and that was something that I felt comfortable doing, so I said yes to that. And then Amy Huntoon, who retired last year, needed someone to take over the art history program, and I also said yes to that. So. And at one point last year, I was teaching a senior elective too, so I actually had 4 preps.
4 preps.
So this year, the 3 is a little bit easier. But I have trouble saying no when people ask me to do things, and so I get myself into some pickles. But it's actually a lot of fun because I'm passionate about everything that I'm teaching, so it doesn't feel too much like a drag.
Yeah, you have a lot of different passions, and similar to a lot of the episodes we've done so far, like Robbie Ford, I remember talking to him on here and just finding out more and more about him that I didn't even know before. So I'm excited to talk to you about everything that you're into and you like to do in school, outside of school, as your profession, at home, whatever. How did you, first maybe we could start, how did you get into teaching? Why did you take this route if you have all these different passions that you could pursue, get a PhD or teach in college, or why Gilman, why all boys school? How'd you get here?
Yeah, I like to joke that it's the family business. So both my parents are teachers, and my grandfather on my mom's side was also a teacher. And some Gilman alums might know his name, Bill Miller. He was in the middle school for 37 years. So that's a weird familial connection that I have with Gilman. But I just kind of fell in love with teaching through exploring camp counseling and teaching program opportunities that I had in college as well. So I tried a couple other things before settling on teaching, and I think I'm a student at heart, and I always feel intellectually stimulated as the teacher as well. So it's rewarding for me. It's not just a job. It's not something that just kind of I do. I genuinely enjoy it. I genuinely like it. So yeah, but I joke it's the family business. Yeah.
That's awesome. And you grew up on a boarding school, correct? Yeah,
I grew up on the campus of the Peddie School in New Jersey. We lovingly called ourselves fac brats. But yeah, I was always around teachers. I think I was in 3rd grade when I realized that not everyone's parents were teachers, because all of the adults in my life were teachers too. So it didn't it took me a minute to figure out that teaching was not the thing that everyone's parents did. So
yeah, almost a lot of those school communities are almost just super small and tightly knit bubbles, and it's hard to see outside of that.
Yeah.
And even at Gilman sometimes, you're in here, you're almost living at this school. I'm right down the street, so it does feel like that sometimes, but there are a lot of positives about that, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had the run of campus when I was a kid growing up. Like, we didn't have curfews necessarily. It was like my parents turned us out in the mornings during the summer and said, come back for lunch. And then after lunch, they'd turn us out again and say, come back for dinner. And then after dinner, we'd probably go back out on campus and like play a game of manhunt with all of our friends who also lived on campus. Yeah. So it was like this almost like utopian childhood of like climbing trees and skinning our knees and racing our bikes. And I look back on it and like think I could probably write a memoir, but maybe not.
About Peddie School.
Yeah, or just like growing up on a campus.
Is Peddie School all girls or is it mixed?
No, it's co-ed.
Co-ed? Okay. Yep. What was that experience like? So you went to Peddie from a very young age all throughout.
Well, so Peddie is only an upper, like a high school. So I went to public school up and through 8th grade and then went to Peddie for high school. So.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so after Peddie, you went to Kenyon. Mm-hmm. Was there anything at Kenyon that funneled you down this direction into teaching, or was it kind of natural? And like Gilman, you have that family connection. Was there something that led you here, or is this kind of just fate that you found the same place that your grandfather taught?
So I think my personal connections with my professors at Kenyon was really influential. Kenyon is like super small, like 1,600 kids. And so my largest class, I think, was like 30. And I was on a first name basis with most of my professors just because, you know, you're small. It's a small campus and you see each other all over the place. And so having those meaningful connections with my professors kind of influenced my decision to teach. But I also think that just kind of the intellectual stimulation I got at Kenyon made me want to look for places that fostered that same kind of community. And so when I was looking for teaching positions, I applied to Gilman, think like having known about Gilman for most of my life, but also like just trying to expand a little bit. And the other schools that I visited didn't feel the way that Kenyon felt, and Gilman had the same kind of community feel. So there was that kind of intangible connection that I felt here.
How would you compare Gilman to Peddie? Is it a similar feel, similar vibe, or is it pretty different?
I think it's pretty similar in some pretty key ways. I think tradition is deeply rooted in both institutions. I think that there's a real sense of camaraderie and community within both communities. But I also think that the nature of a boys' school makes it a little, like Gilman particularly, makes it a little bit different. And I was looking for something different. I didn't want exactly the same.
Gotcha.
So.
All boys school as a female teacher coming in, was that a tough decision to make, or was that something where you were like, I feel pretty comfortable on campus at an all boys school?
I think I was a little bit scared at first. I think it made me a little bit nervous. But I also had some really great mentors initially to kind of help me through that initial process of like figuring out where I stood and where I fit in with the faculty and within the greater community. So was it scary? Yeah. But I think I didn't necessarily need to be scared. I think it was just something new.
Yeah, especially teaching in the upper school, like if you don't act a certain way, the class can kind of get out of control. And I felt that at some points, and I was maybe on the defense my first year, but because I was wary of that. I was like, I'm teaching 11th graders and, they're going to try to get away with things, and I have to maybe act a certain way because I'm so close in age to them. How did you jump right into the classroom and kind of find your style?
So I think I had a little bit of an advantage because I was working with 9th graders, and they were just as, I think, scared as I was in some ways. They're now the little guys on the big campus, and by little, I mean like some of them were like maybe 100 pounds soaking wet when I first started teaching. They've grown since, obviously. But so I think I had that advantage. But I also think that like I was on the defensive early on just because I wasn't sure what they were trying to test me, like where they were going. But I really tried to foster kind of a camaraderie and a community within my own classroom. So I think by November, most of them had me figured out and I had them figured out. So we didn't have to see eye to eye on things, but we had a mutual respect for each other. I think that made my first year of teaching pretty successful, honestly.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's awesome. That's pretty lucky, I think. My first year, I would say it was successful, and I was definitely in a similar way as you were, influenced by my mentors, especially Brian, during that experience. But it was difficult, and I don't know if I broke out of the weird gender dynamic funk with the girls' schools and the guys in the room for the same class, for the first class, really, for most of them. It was a little awkward for that first year, but that's awesome to hear that your first year kind of gave you some momentum going into the rest of. I think first year is probably the hardest, in my opinion.
I would say my second year was definitely the harder one.
Okay.
I think I was no longer concerned about how I was teaching. I was more concerned about improving what I had learned my first year. And so I think I was more critical of myself my second year, picking up an additional class, kind of realizing mistakes that I had made my first year and wanting to change that. So my first year was kind of a blur. I think it was successful, but I think I was just kind of on I was always going. The gears were always moving. And my second year, when I had time to sit and kind of reflect, I was there are things that can be fixed. There are things that I can do better. And so that was a little bit, I think, more challenging for me, honestly.
Yeah. And for people who don't know, you were part of the UPenn Fellowship program. So I talked with Erica on the last podcast about how the Penn Fellowship not only gives you that mentorship coming in, but is really just a reflective practice. The whole thing is reflective. And I think that's so key to teaching, is you're always looking, and not every teacher does this. And I probably in my third year of teaching don't do this as often as I should. But the best thing to do is look at your class that you just taught. What I do well? What could I have done better? And then you continue to increase throughout the rest of that year, or improve throughout the rest of that year. And that was really beneficial to me in that second year specifically, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I think, too, I have a tendency to be overly critical of myself. I'm trying to recognize that. And so I will think something has gone horribly and someone else will be like, oh, my gosh, that was wonderful. And I'm starting to have to learn to listen to other people when they compliment me, because I'm not very good at taking compliments.
Oh, I'm the same way. And Brian was so complimentary my first and second year, and I was like, Brian, come on.
Right. Brooks was my mentor, and I will say this over and over again, best mentor I could have ever had. But he was always like, oh my gosh, that lesson went so well. And I was like, really? Because I think this, and this, flopped or whatever. And so just kind of learning to take feedback is something that I think I'm still working on, but slowly getting better at.
So and that's another thing that Gilman does really well, is pairs the fellows and the first year teachers here who are kind of just thrown into the classroom, trying to get that experience. But Gilman sets you up really nicely with a mentor that will fit, in my experience. How was that for you with Brooks? How did Gilman get that right?
I think Brooks is just a natural mentor anyway, and it made sense because I was coming into the history department, and he's been here for a while and had been teaching world cultures probably as long as the world cultures curriculum has been in place, and so it was a natural kind of choice for functionality purposes, but also I think I interviewed and got to sit in on one of his classes, and I really enjoyed the way he taught, and we had a good conversation. And so I think there was some kind of reciprocity in that. He wanted to work with me and I wanted to work with him even before we got paired together. So it worked out really nicely.
Yeah, that's awesome. So now that you're pretty comfortable here at Gilman, you're teaching 3 different preps. What are you doing with this new hybrid model, and how are you figuring out this whole experience? And I think this might be helpful for some of the other teachers at Gilman and people outside the community too, who are maybe watching this. Where have you found success with this whole new system of learning? And I've said before that the Penn Fellowship experience helped me with all the systems and the learning management tools and technology that we're all using now as teachers, but maybe you have some things that are working really well for you in the classroom so far this year.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm going to couch this in saying, like, I think everyone's trying things that, like, work and don't work. And so, take this for what it is. I have found that student-led work in this model is more beneficial than a lecture-based or kind of like roundtable discussion based, because it's so easy to pick up your phone when you're on a Zoom call and kind of zone out if all you have to do is take notes. And so what I've found is that if you're asking students to become the expert on something and then bring that to the table and discuss with their classmates, you get more engagement from them and from their classmates as well. And so what I've been trying to do is small group work. I've been trying to do student-led discussions, some fish bowls. So things that allow the student to the students to kind of drive what's happening in class. Mm-hmm. Like, do I have classes where I'm like, we have stuff to get through and you're going to have to just bear with me for 70 minutes while we talk about the election of 1800? Yes. Mm-hmm. But I think what's more beneficial is when students are actively kind of engaged in researching and finding the answers themselves instead of being fed the answers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And bringing that to the table and feeling that responsibility where, I mean, even for anyone, like sitting on a Zoom call, it's just so distracting. Right. You have everything right there at your fingertips. I mean, I don't blame them in some sense. You are still in class, but like it's just human instinct. If something pops up on your computer, I mean, we saw in this social dilemma, like it's all targeted.
Absolutely.
It's like it's grasping your receptors and
and we're like conditioned to get to want that feedback, right? And so when something buzzes in our pocket, there's that dopamine rush. There's what did I get? And so I don't blame the student. Like, I do it, right? Like, mm-hmm. We've been on faculty meetings that have gone just a little bit too long and we start checking mm-hmm. whatever social media we want to check. So I just try to keep it relevant and I try to keep it more kind of tactile mm-hmm. in terms of engagement.
So for that history class, I'm interested because talking to Kevin Hudson on the podcast and just my sense of what a history class looks like, a lot of videos and movies, but that's pretty difficult right now, I think, to show movies and films and videos during this virtual setup. How is that history class going? I'm interested in what you guys are learning in there and talking about.
Yeah, so in the U.S., we're on our unit on slavery and the Civil War, which is like the most depressing unit to send them off into winter break with. So sorry, kids. But I love kind of online platforms that allow you to post movies or post clips and then have them engage with that. So Edpuzzle is a really cool platform. So you can post a YouTube clip or a movie of some sort and add questions in. And so they're watching the clip and then it pauses because there's a question and then they answer the question. And then at that point, they can then continue on with the clip that they're watching. So it there's engagement there and it doesn't get choppy. So like we've all tried to kind of screen share and watch movies together and it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. Audio and the video don't match up together. The quality's horrible. So I like Edpuzzle. I like kind of sending them off on a this or that kind of scavenger hunt. So with my 9th graders, we did an intro to sub-Saharan Africa, and they were offered two kind of sources for each kind of topic, I guess, mm-hmm. and they could watch this one or that one, and then they went on to the next one. They chose one or the other, and so kind of student agency, but also exploring different avenues within that.
And again, giving them some agency and choice and. Yeah, that's definitely effective for this situation right now.
Absolutely.
So in terms of your history, and did you study history? Did you say you studied history in college?
I was a double major because I'm that masochist. I double majored in art history and history, and my history concentration was Atlantic world relations. So kind of the process of colonization, decolonization, and independence movements in and around the Atlantic.
And you were telling me your thesis was on piracy in
Yeah,
college?
my thesis was on pirate economics, legislation, and kind of these proto-socialist communities that evolved on pirate ships.
Yeah, that was interesting to me because I didn't know too much about piracy before that conversation. And you were saying that you might want to have some type of senior elective on that. I think that'd be cool.
Yeah, I'm rolling around in my head how I would approach that.
Yeah.
Kind of, thinking about who I would include and what I would include. But pirates are definitely something I'm fascinated by.
How did you get into pirates and piracy?
This is going to sound so dumb, but Pirates of the Caribbean.
Really?
The movie franchise. I thought, I loved it. I thought, I love historical dramas to begin with, mostly because I like to pick them apart and, figure out what's not accurate. And when I tried to do that with Pirates of the Caribbean, I found that it was actually very accurate. So that kind of sparked this interest in, okay, historically accurate piracy. Let's talk about why and how. Mm-hmm. And so that's where that started.
So if I wanted to go home and look up some pirates and learn more about piracy, where do you think I should start?
So there are a couple pirates in kind of urban legends that are actual people. So Blackbeard's an actual pirate. His ship was wrecked off the coast of South Carolina. So divers on clear ocean days can actually go and see the Queen Anne's Revenge. So Blackbeard is a real pirate. The guy on our the rum bottle, Captain Morgan, is also a real pirate. So that is another person that you could kind of dive into.
Captain Morgan, where does he
Captain Morgan was a British pirate kind of based out of Barbados. And he had this really bad habit of sailing to Port Royal, Jamaica, sacking the city, and sailing away. And then after 3 or 4 years, when they had rebuilt the city, he would sail back and he would sack the city and sail away. And I think the 3rd or 4th time he showed up at Port Royal, Jamaica, they recognized his flag, and the governor of the city came out, ran out onto the docks and basically said, please stop burning our city to the ground. Stop stealing from us. If you, don't do that, you can be governor. And Captain Morgan was like, that sounds like a good deal. And so Henry Morgan gave up piracy to become the governor of Port Royal, Jamaica.
So they bribed him?
They bribed him.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Bribery is big in piracy.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. That's cool. So you wrote your thesis on piracy and got into it from Pirates of the Caribbean. That's pretty cool. How about your interest in art history? Where did that spark?
So when I was in high school, I had a gaping hole in my schedule for senior year, and the only thing other than a math class that would fill that hole was AP art history. And so I took AP art history as a senior in high school, and just kind of fell in love with it. I had always appreciated art. I'd always been the kid that really wanted to go to museums. But
ever an artist yourself, or just kind of
no,
appreciated it?
I tell people that I look at art and I study art, but I don't make it myself. That's my sister's job. So our AP art history senior year was just kind of eye-opening, and I had a wonderful teacher who really kind of made it accessible. Although the first day of class, she did walk in and say no one in the history of this class has ever gotten lower than a 5 on the exam. So there was some pressure there from her, but she made it really fun and really easy. And so took that, and then I went to college and kind of decided I wanted to explore what Kenyon did with art history, and fell in love with most of the professors. And so it was kind of a done deal that I was going to major in art history, and then history tacked itself onto it because I was drawing parallels between my history classes and my art history classes.
Was there a specific class that you took at Kenyon that you really liked or enjoyed, and that made you want to continue with art history as a track?
So I think the first one so Kenyon breaks up kind of survey of art into 2 parts based on semester. And so survey part 2, I took my second semester of freshman year and like fell in love with the way that the professor taught the course, and then went on to take like as many classes as I could with him, just because he made it so much fun and he was engaging and he was colloquial. So I loved survey too. But I think the class that sticks with me the most from Kenyon was my history of African American art class, which was really fascinating, and art that like no one had told me about before, but was so pervasive. And so I was really kind of intrigued by the way that the class was set up, and this class was set up based on kind of the framing and reframing of the Black body in American imagery, both by white people and by Black people. And I found it so powerful. So I actually like modeled an elective off of it for Gilman students, but loved that. Found it really helpful in kind of deciphering pop culture and kind of the imagery that we are saturated with, in music and in video and kind of the film industry as well, and sports. There's a lot of talk about the Black body in sports and what that means for the American psyche. So that class was kind of like an eye-opening experience for me.
Black body in sports, I'm curious. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, the way that the Black body or Black people in the United States are valued kind of for what the physicality of them is, and not necessarily intellectual. And I'm not saying that like no Black people are valued for their intellectual capacity, but my professor did this thing where he was like, name 5 famous Black people, and like 95% of the class named like Martin Luther King Jr. and like 4 athletes. And so there's this kind of interesting discussion going on about like what we value as an American society, right? We value football, we value basketball. Well, a majority of those athletes are Black. How does that kind of play into how we depict Black people?
Or how we maybe stereotype?
Stereotype or kind of funnel them into channels, right? Like, so are we valuing a student who is academically inclined, or are we valuing the student who wants to go D1 in a sport? And like where that kind of dichotomy is.
So just in general here at Gilman, because Gilman emphasizes as athletics so much, how do you think we balance the academics with the athletics here? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that the competitive nature of athletics, I think, funnels really well into kind of academic drive as well. Some of the best students I've taught have been also phenomenal athletes. And so I think what Gilman does is foster this idea that like academic pursuits and athletic pursuits are not in conflict with each other. In fact, if you would like to go to college to play sports, you should also look at colleges that are going to feed you intellectually, right? And my experience in college as an NCAA athlete was also one of academic pursuit and athletic pursuit that did not take away from each other. So I really like that Gilman emphasizes both equally, because you don't have to just be a student, you don't have to just be an athlete. There's a blending that goes on because athletics are part of the school day. Do you think
so you were swimming and water polo in college?
I didn't play water polo. No, I got to Gilman and they were like, so swimming and water, you can coach water polo, right? I was like, they're very different, but I will learn. So
you had to learn a lot.
I had to learn a lot about water polo initially, but I was a swimmer in college. So yeah. Okay.
But if you were at Kenyon, do you think if you hadn't swam there, do you think like how would that have changed your experience at Kenyon if you didn't have the athletic piece?
Yeah, I think it would have been a very different experience. And I don't know that it would have been a bad different, but I think it would have been very different. I ran in some very different circles. So Miss Royals, who's new in the English department, and was actually 2 years behind me at Kenyon. And like, I knew her name, but we never really interacted because our circles were so different.
At such a small school.
Such a small school, right? And so I think part of it is the swimming program at Kenyon is really intense. And so I was practicing 10 times a week. And so the people that I was spending time with were people that had a similar schedule to myself, right? So I was in bed by 11 every night and not partying because I had to get up at 5:20 for practice because I had to get in the pool at 6 a.m., right? And then I was also, getting homework done in between classes because I had to be in the pool from 4 to 6 in the evening, and then eating dinner and getting work done. And so naturally you kind of find people with a similar schedule as yourself, and that was my teammates. But I think my experience at Kenyon would have been different, but I don't necessarily think it would have been any worse.
But I think having a sport where you are mandated to go to practice at these times forces you to make that schedule and go to bed when you did. And having a set schedule is so important, as we have found out during COVID, right?
Right.
Like having a set schedule that you have to follow every day in order to be successful in the pool and in the classroom is like crucial. And I think as an athlete in college, if I didn't have lacrosse to like help schedule my day,
right,
I would have done other things. And people say all the time, if I didn't have the sport, I would have done way better in school. And I don't know if that's true.
I think I would have done worse in school.
Yeah.
I think swimming disciplined me to the point where I had everything down and scheduled. And I think that if I had gotten those 4 hours of my life back that I was spending in the pool every day, I don't know that I would have done anything more productive during those times. So the time crunch for me made me very productive. But if I even when the season ended, my productivity went down. Like I had time between 4 and 6 in the afternoons and I wasn't doing anything with that time. Right. And so the schedule made me a better student, I think.
And it's also just exercise too. Like you come back from practice and your brain is refreshed and you can sit down for a couple hours and do your homework and then go to bed.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you have to exercise anyway. And like people don't really think about scheduling those parts of their day, but you get lost in whatever, if you're watching a Netflix show or, going to the museum, you get lost in that time and you don't have anywhere to be.
Right.
Like, really.
Exactly.
What was the most difficult part for you at Kenyon, being a student athlete with a double major? You're writing a thesis. You're into all these different fields. You have to go to bed early and wake up early. Like, what was the most difficult part of that experience?
I think recognizing probably my junior year that I had limited myself socially to my teammates. And I'm not saying my teammates weren't wonderful. They were wonderful, and they're some of my best friends. But I think I did not make time for people outside of my team. And so I ended up in this bubble that got kind of toxic in some respects, right? Like if you're with the same, and again, we've figured this out with COVID, right? When you were in your little pod and you're not seeing anyone else out of that pod, I think that there can be things that you recognize about someone that really drive you nuts, or like you do things that you don't recognize drive other people nuts. And so there's this kind of toxicity that builds within that group. And so recognizing that I had limited myself socially was, I think, a hard thing for me to swallow initially. And then when I finally swallowed my pride and started to hang out with other people, it was a lot, I don't want to say better, because I don't think it was better. I just think I had different outlets for different things. I could be a nerd for art with people who weren't on my team, right? So most of my teammates were STEM majors. I think that's just kind of the nature of swimming as a sport. It kind of draws people who are kind of interested in the STEM world. And so I was one of 4 or 5 humanities people on the team. And so
how big was the team? How many girls were on the team?
It was 80 people total between men's and women's.
Oh.
So 40 maybe.
It wasn't that small of a circle.
It wasn't. But I was also, my training group was pretty insular because I was a distance swimmer and there are just naturally fewer of them. So I was not interacting with all of the people on the team every day because I was training with just that handful of people.
Gotcha. Well, I think that's good advice for people who are going to college, because it's very easy to get in with a crew your freshman year and stay with that group. And part of college is just meeting people and figuring out, getting to know yourself more through other people and learning more about just meeting random people in college. I still talk to people today that I met my freshman year, and that's really why I feel for this freshman group right now during COVID, because it's a crucial time to meet new people that you're going to have connection with for a while after.
The best thing I did was live with someone not on the team. So living in a dorm with someone who did not have my schedule was like the best thing I could have done, I think.
Yeah, it's nice to go back after a long day of practice and talk to someone else about other things.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean by it can get toxic if that sport is your whole life and you have no break from it.
Right.
And a lot of that energy, whether it's good or bad, can rub off. If there's a bad week at practice, everyone's going to feel that. And it's going to be, it's going to be bad for the team.
Definitely.
But it's nice to get away and then come back refreshed. Awesome. So I'm curious about the art history class that you teach at Gilman and what you guys are doing in that class this year. Yeah,
so this is AP Art History. It's coordinated, so I have 9 students this year. I have 4 Gilman students. I have 3 Bryn Mawr students and 2 RPCS students. And they have been, it's an awesome group, and they're intellectually curious. And so our conversations are awesome. But we have just finished the Baroque period, which for those of you, for people who don't know what Baroque period is, it's right after the Reformation. So there's a pretty big split kind of stylistically between countries and artists who are Catholic and countries and artists who are Protestant. So it's this really interesting period in art where the art really reflects kind of the religious and political climate of the time period.
How was Protestant art different from?
So the Protestant Reformation, particularly with the Calvinistic kind of leanings of a lot of the newly Protestant countries, really frowned on image making. So one of the commandments is thou shalt not make graven images. And for the Protestant church took that pretty literally. So they whitewashed their churches. They removed icons. They weren't painting images of holy figures anymore. And so it changes what the paintings are about. So you get a lot more landscape. You get a lot more genre scenes. It's very reserved almost. You're not seeing you're not seeing the more dramatic pieces. Like
biblical imagery.
Right. So, and then the Catholic countries are engaging in the Counter-Reformation, which is basically hey, come back. We want you back. This is the true church. And they do that through image making. So things get more dramatic. The biblical imagery becomes more beautiful and more gold encrusted and more opulent, just to kind of demonstrate kind of the beauty of that church. So there's a really cool split between what artists are doing in primarily the northern countries, so the Dutch, the Netherlands, parts of England, and also what Italy is doing or what Flanders is doing, what Spain is doing at that time.
Who were some of the artists from the Protestant side who were making those landscapes and those less realistic portrayals of biblical imagery?
So some of the Northern Baroque painters that you should probably be aware of are Jan Vermeer, who's actually Catholic, but painting in the Netherlands, so he can't really be overtly Catholic. So he does a lot of
he's undercover almost.
Yeah, he's undercover. So Girl with the Pearl Earring is his, Woman Holding a Balance is his. Rembrandt van Rijn is working in the Netherlands at that time. Rachel Roysch and Judith Leyster are 2 women who are doing a really great job of making money as painters in the Northern Baroque period. And then down south, you have artists like Diego Velázquez in Spain, Caravaggio in Italy, Artemisia Gentileschi in Italy, who are doing these really dramatic scenes.
These are Catholic.
They're Catholic,
Catholics.
Yeah.
So Caravaggio is an interesting figure that you guys were just learning about.
Yeah, Caravaggio is this really cool... he's kind of the bad boy of Baroque art. Legend has it he murdered a guy and had to go on the run for a little bit. But he is probably most famous for his depiction of the calling of St. Matthew, He also does the conversion of St. Paul, and some genre scenes with like mildly androgynous looking men in kind of Bacchus-like regalia. So he's an interesting character.
The Calling of St. Matthew is a painting that if you haven't seen it, you should
see it. Yeah,
you should definitely check out, because the way that Jesus is pointing at Matthew is like very lackadaisical, right? And Matthew is pointing at himself.
Yep.
Like you're looking at, he's a tax collector.
Yeah. So Matthew's a tax collector, which is like a big no-no in the biblical time period, right? Like tax collectors didn't have a set salary, and so they collected the taxes for Rome, but then like added on money so they could make money for themselves. And like people just, generally didn't like tax collectors. And so Jesus is calling a tax collector to be one of his disciples. And the way that Caravaggio paints it is really interesting, because the light is not on Jesus, which is like
he's in the shadows.
He's in the shadows, and the hand gesture of like the call is very reminiscent of the hand that Michelangelo does in the Sistine Chapel creating of Adam. So there's like reciprocity and kind of a recognition of who's come before him in that.
Yeah, the in Matthew too, he's pointing at himself, but he also has his hand on the money that he's collecting.
Right.
But I think Caravaggio is most known for his not only his biblical depictions and his realistic portrayals, which like was probably definitely frowned upon. Like he was painting people like right off the streets almost, right? And the church was like, you shouldn't be painting like
randos.
Yeah, right, exactly. But the way he uses light.
So he pioneers a technique called chiaroscuro, which basically is an Italian word for shadows. And the way that he always has very dramatic light coming in from one particular place. And so oftentimes it's the upper left-hand corner of the painting. But he also he's hyper saturating his colors, and also really emphasizing the contrast between light and dark. So like even if the scene itself is not dramatic, the lighting makes it dramatic, which is something really interesting that he does.
Yeah, and seeing that during a time period when you don't have like today HD TVs and all this stuff, and seeing the way that he portrayed such like important biblical figures was probably like out of this world. It was amazing. Yeah, it's amazing to see it today.
Exactly. And he's definitely he's incorporating Leonardo's use of sfumato, which is like smoky. So the way that he blends it, and he's amping it up, he's creating even more drama with the way that colors are rendered and the way that lines kind of disappear. Caravaggio is particularly good at like hiding his brush strokes, right? So like even if you got up very close to the painting, it would be very hard for you to find brush strokes in it because it's so clean and well blended.
Is Rembrandt similar in that
Rembrandt
way?
is brushier. Rembrandt definitely uses similar lighting techniques, but he's more expressive. The brush strokes are looser. He's also more expressive in his etchings. So Rembrandt does a series of etchings too, most people don't know about, but you'll have hyper detail in areas of the etching like the face or the neck, and then like the shoulder is just like a squiggly line to suggest a shoulder. The feather in his hat is a bunch of lines to suggest a feather. But what's brilliant about Rembrandt is that he can use those different kind of techniques to really bring together the full photo, like the full image for you.
And where was he painting, Rembrandt?
He's up in the Netherlands.
Okay. And you were telling me Vermeer, you guys were talking about Vermeer the other day, and he's another amazing in terms of light and like the light coming through the windows, right?
Yep.
What do you discuss when you bring up Vermeer in class? And
Vermeer is interesting because he's Catholic living in the Netherlands, and so he wants to include and does include some religious imagery in his art, but it has to be a little bit clandestine. It can't be overt. But he's also kind of embracing the scientific revolutions that are happening around him. So we're pretty sure he's using something called the Camera Obscura, which is an early lens. So if you think about like the old cameras where you like put your head under the hood and like looked through the lens, he's doing something like that. And what the lens is doing is projecting onto a canvas where he can then trace and kind of sketch. So it's heightening his ability to really capture that moment of the scene. And some art historians are wholly critical of that approach and say, well, it's not pure genius because he's not doing it from sight. And other art historians really appreciate his ingenuity, right? Like he's using the tools around him to produce work that's unique and hyper real and also contemplative.
The girl with the pearl earring is sometimes called the female Mona Lisa. The Dutch Mona Lisa. Dutch Mona Lisa. Why is that so? That's like such a famous piece. Why is that so famous and well regarded?
Yeah, I think it's enigmatic, just like Leonardo's Mona Lisa is, right? Like you're not entirely sure where this girl is. You're not entirely sure what her deal is. But it's also and like you have to understand kind of the buttoned up, kind of reserved, like social scene at the time period, but. It's inherently sexual. And there are a couple ways that we know this. One, she's making direct eye contact with the viewer, which was like not a ladylike thing to do. And her mouth is also open, which was a suggestion of sexuality, of understanding her own sexual nature. So putting that with a striking gaze is... It was kind of scandalous at the time period. But it's also this display of wealth and kind of opulence. She's wearing this beautiful turban that is blue and gold, and those are two colors that are ridiculously expensive at that time. Gold is obviously expensive still today, but the blue pigment had to be lapis lazuli, which had to be imported from Afghanistan, which meant that you had to grind it down. And so it's a really expensive commodity. I mean, you will look at commissions for paintings from the time period, and they're not telling the artist like what to paint. They're saying like, you will use this many florins of blue in this. So that's like it dictates how much blue and how much color is used, which is an indicator that it was really expensive.
And similar to the Mona Lisa, right? Because Mona Lisa, you move anywhere in the room and it seems like she's always following you. Maybe not the same thing with the girl with the pearl earring, but you can't really tell which way she's turning, right? That's another part of that painting. Absolutely.
I think I interpret it as like you've called her name and she is looking behind herself to see who's called her name. I think the other thing, right, is like, are we going to ignore the ping pong ball sized pearl in her ear? Like we can't, because pearls were so expensive and so revered in that time period as something that women could wear to subtly show their wealth and status, right? In a society where they're emphasizing kind of modesty and they're emphasizing kind of reserved appearances, pearls were actually accepted. And so you could wear these large pearls and let people know that you had money. I mean, like, and they're like beautiful too. So.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm so curious about how you get Gilman boys, and like just knowing some of the guys, some of them for sure would be interested in this, but some would be like, why do I need to know about like the girl with the pearl earring? How do you get those kids and make them interested in that kind of art?
I think first and foremost, people in general, not just Gilman boys, are supremely impressed with skill. Something that they cannot do, right? Now, when we get into modernist art and we get into abstract expressionism and things that, quote unquote, I could have done that, like then it gets a little bit harder. But art that is fundamentally something that they could not produce and or fundamentally could not reproduce, I think they find to be fascinating anyway. I also think that like art is interesting once you understand it. I think to understand it, you need to hear the context behind it a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And so like telling these stories, right? Like people perk up when they hear like Caravaggio might have murdered a dude. Like that seems that adds something to it, right? So for, Girl with the Pearl Earring to be inherently sexual, like might be like something that makes a student more interested in learning about a portrait of a girl that they don't have a name for.
So you almost have these talking points that are just going to get the boys to perk up, and then you can kind of go into the details of the piece.
Right. Like, what is so exciting about art is like there are always little nuggets that you can pull out of it that can be really kind of tantalizing for students. Or
like arguments, exactly what it is, or arguments about this person says this about this.
Right.
She's turning this way. This person says she's, turning the other way. Right. And then the boys are like, no, I think she's turning this way. And then you got them.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, there are always little things and pieces that you can point out. Like, so, Michelangelo paints the Sistine Chapel, and he also paints the wall behind the chapel. And it's a Last Judgment scene. And, one of my favorite things to point out, because everyone like kind of like bristles at it, is saints will carry the attribute of their martyrdom with them. So like Saint Stephen always has a rock because he was stoned to death. Well, Saint Barnabas was like flayed alive. And so the attribute he holds is his own skin. And so what Michelangelo does is he's got this guy holding a skin suit in his hand. And like that is kind of gruesome and kind of gory, but also like really interesting.
Right. Once you understand the symbolism and the history and the figures and what they're all about, it puts everything together. Right. And that's why it's important to take a class, right? Like it's one thing to just go into the museum and look at it and say, okay, I don't know who these people are. Right. But if you're sitting in your class and taking each piece, who is this? Why is their face like that? Right. What is the symbolism here? I think that makes anyone appreciate art more.
Yeah. Well, and I love art too, because art has so many layers to it, right? Like the first layer is like appreciation. Like, that is beautiful. Yep. I want to look at that thing. And then you can dig even deeper into the historical analysis and the formal analysis of it. And art is something that I think keeps on giving, right? You can continue to pull things out of works. Like, I sit in class and look at a work and notice something that I hadn't noticed before. Yeah. Like, and I have been studying this for upwards of 10 years at this point. Like, there's always something more that I can find. And so I find that art is something that's very connective in that way.
Yeah. I mean, you can even just, so I do, Edward Hopper is one of my favorite American artists. And I just find his pieces so open-ended. Like, what is going on here? What is this person doing? What are they thinking about? I use that in my English class just to get the ball rolling sometimes and connect it to whatever it is we're talking about. But I just like hearing, what do you notice? What does my class notice about this? And then I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. I didn't notice that either. Right.
One of my favorite questions to ask is, or prompts to give, is listen to this piece, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but what I'm asking students to do is kind of absorb the visual and apply audio to it. So there are some pieces that are quiet and contemplative, and then there are some pieces that are really loud and cacophonous and chaotic, and kind of allowing them to sit with that can help them draw even more out of cool. a piece.
Listen to this piece.
Yeah, listen to it.
I like that. So what are you guys working on next? Where are you going in this course?
So
it's a full year, right?
It's a full year. So we're still kind of in European vein-ish. So after we finish Baroque, we're going to move into neoclassical, neoclassicism. So we're going to talk about Jacques-Louis David. This is where kind of the French Academy becomes really important. The French Academy becomes the kind of end-all, be-all for art.
What's the French Academy?
So the Academy of the Academy of Good Art is what it translates to, and they're kind of like the governing body. Think about it; it's like the NCAA of art, essentially, right? They're the ones that are kind of telling everyone what the best kind of painting is, what the best kind of sculpture is. They're the ones that are exhibiting the artwork, so they're really calling the shots, and it becomes very rigid and it becomes very standard. And so we'll move out of kind of the drama of the Baroque into a formulaic depiction of very specific kinds of art and very specific kinds of scenes with the neoclassical period.
Who gave them the authority to...
I think they just took it.
They just took it.
Yeah, it's, I think it started as a group of artists who like were teaching and apprenticing other growing artists. And then, sometimes things get bigger.
What artists came out of this period that...
You're going to look at Jacques-Louis David. You're going to look at Angelica Kauffman. Some of the best kind of American portrait artists are coming out of this period as well. You're looking at kind of architects like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is neoclassical.
Okay. I just went there a couple weeks ago. I don't know if I told you that, but it was one of the most like stunning, like.
Yeah. So like, we're looking at rationality.
What I expected when I was going to Monticello was this massive mansion, like out of control, huge, just from the picture. You can't really get a sense of how big it is.
Right.
But it's like, it's almost the perfect size, like the building. Mm-hmm. It's very sound. I went inside too. It's just, I think it's a worthwhile trip to take just to see like the architecture of that and how that was built.
Yeah, and the neoclassical period is all about rationality, all about architecture that makes sense visually, right? So it's symmetrical. We're looking at things that are going to recall the classical antiquity, so columns and pilasters and kind of like a re-interest in kind of scientific proportions, right? So perfect circles, perfect squares, perfect triangles, that kind of stuff, because it's sturdy. Yeah. Visually, it conveys this idea of permanence and of kind of importance,
like robustness,
right? So like, there's a reason that the American Capitol and other buildings for the federal government are all neoclassical, right? Mm-hmm. Like they give off a sense of permanence and of importance and objectivity in some respect, right? So we're not, building Victorian mansions to house the Supreme Court. It looks like a Greek temple front, right? So,
do you have a favorite period that you teach or that you've studied on your own? I know that's a tough question, but is there anything that you really look forward to?
I love World War I and kind of the after effects of that on the art world. I think we have a group of artists that are so disillusioned with what's just happened, and so they can't do anything except express that in art, and becomes a little bit grotesque, and it becomes a little bit less palatable, and it's this really beautiful expression of the angst that people were experiencing after the horrors of the war. And I also love propaganda posters. I think they're fascinating in a historical sense, but also like artistically, you get people to produce, really stunning depictions of kind of this idyllic person or scene.
Do you use any political cartoons in your classes?
Nast. I love Nast. Yeah. I think he's hysterical. So we'll use him. We talk, Kathy Kollwitz is cartoonist out of Germany at that point, and so she's doing some cartoons and some other lithographic work for kind of publication. That's
fascinating. Yeah, you teach some cool classes. I would love to check those out and
pop in.
I always wanted to take an art history class, but I feel like they were always scheduled like during the afternoon when I was tied up with other things. But I do love art history and art and just like really what we're talking about, that gray middle ground of conversation and discussion. I was in an art class last night doing some painting, and this guy he was phenomenal and just so knowledgeable. But he, for the last maybe 25 minutes of the class, was going on in a tangent about whether Van Gogh killed himself or not. And that's just like I watched that movie at Eternity's Gate, which I would recommend to anyone, about Van Gogh's life. But that question of how did he die? Did kids kill him? Like just random kids shot him after a day of painting? Did he come home after a day of painting, something that he loved to do, and shoot himself? Like how did Van Gogh die? And it was funny, interesting how this painter teacher he was like, yeah, I just like have a sense that this is what happened, and he explains why exactly he thought that. But there's definitely room for discussion there, and experts and historians disagree about all this stuff. So,
well, it's funny that I think art historians disagree about things more frequently than they agree about things, right? So a couple years ago, a painting emerged that, art historians kind of examined and decided that this was a genuine Leonardo painting, right? The Salvador Mundi sold for $450 million at Sotheby's.
Like most...
It was the highest...
Ever.
Yeah, $450 million for a single painting. And art historians still don't agree whether or not it's an actual Leonardo, right? Like there are art historians who are adamant that it is not a Leonardo. It's from his workshop. It's a student of his, and they have very specific visual cues that bring them to that conclusion. And then the art historians who are like, this is a genuine Leonardo, also have very specific visual cues that it's a Leonardo. And like my opinion on it is that it is, but like I'm also not a Leonardo expert, but like studying his work and looking at this piece lead me to believe that it is a genuine Leonardo. So it's this really interesting like disagreement on something that's still sold for $450 million.
Wow.
It's currently in Abu Dhabi.
That is absurd.
So,
and that's and what that surpassed another painting. I think we talked about it the other day. Your favorite artist, New York City.
Banksy? No. Favorite artist, New York City.
Like his artwork is very. It's kind of
Basquiat.
Yeah, Basquiat.
Yeah.
Yeah, his has sold recently for.
Yeah, he's the highest grossing.
In America, maybe?
Yeah, maybe the highest grossing American artist or the highest grossing artist of color. Yeah, I mean, his work is genius. I think he was tortured and really kind of the epitome of an artistic genius. And it's a shame that we lost him at 27. But yeah.
So his work, I think most people would look at that and be those people who say, I could do this. If you have a kid in your class, and I've always wondered this, who says, Miss Lloyd, I could do this.
Yeah.
What do you say about a Basquiat?
So I think the common retort is, yeah, but you didn't. And like that can be helpful in some ways, but like supremely unhelpful in other ways. I think the more you understand artists and the artistic process, you understand that everything they do is a choice. So like Basquiat's classically trained. He could paint like Leonardo if he wanted to. He was choosing not to. And there are politics involved in that, and there are kind of, artistic zeitgeist choices being made with his art. So I think that there's this conversation between the artist and the artwork as it's being created that really kind of resonates in that sense.
Yeah. And I think just to go along with your point, like I started painting here at Gilman just in the art room with Connolly, and the process of actually doing it myself and seeing what mine looks like you appreciate the masters so much more, the greats so much more, from actually trying it yourself, because that retort, yeah, but you didn't, is I think somewhat true, because let's see what you have,
right?
Because it's definitely it's hard. It takes a lot of time,
right?
And these like Basquiat and Picasso, Picasso could paint proportions perfectly when he was 13 years old.
Yeah, and he chose not to, right? And why didn't he choose to continue to paint that way? They're pushing boundaries. I think art is all about pushing boundaries, right? So people dislike modernists, right? Because it doesn't make any sense to them, or it doesn't make visual, it's not visually appealing in whatever way. I don't particularly like Picasso, but I think his work is incredibly important for kind of the oeuvre of the time period where, discussions of what art is becoming more in focus.
You can still appreciate his genius, even though maybe you wouldn't hang it above your bedroom.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Wow, that is really cool. Very fascinating. I want to get to your book that you brought in.
Yeah.
Try to start off the podcast with this, but we always end up finishing off with the book. So.
I think finishing with a book is a good way to do it. So.
Yeah. So what would you recommend to anyone, Gilman community and beyond, to read?
Yeah, so this is called The Fire This Time. It's an edited collection of essays by Jesmyn Ward. And what she does is riffs off of Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. which is it's a collection of essays about race in America. This comes out right after 2015, which is when kind of the uprisings around Eric Gardner's death and Tamir Rice's death are happening, the Baltimore riots as well. And so I love this because everyone who writes in this, just the way that they write is absolutely gorgeous. But also the emotion in it is still palpable. It's raw in some respects. And so as someone who is looking at my own kind of race and my own racial privilege, this was really helpful for me to kind of get maybe the narrative understanding of racial injustice that we often ask of Black people, but they are unwilling to give in some aspects because it's really not their job to do it. I got that from this. So it's this really interesting and poignant look at a very specific moment in American history.
2015, you said?
2015, yeah.
Okay.
And Jesmyn Ward has her own essay in it, but we also, have Edwidge Danticat, who's a Haitian American writer. She writes The Dew Breaker, which is another book that I, ugly cried over. I ugly cry over a lot of books. Kevin Young, Clint Smith. So there's this really amazing kind of collection of American and other writers in this book that is eye-opening in a lot of ways.
In what ways did this change your perspective or point of view on race in America? Yeah,
I think so. There are a couple essays that I found really really powerful. I think so. It's in 3 parts. You have Legacy, Reckoning, and Jubilee, and kind of looking at some of these essays. Cracking the Code by Jesmyn Ward was really fascinating because, and White Rage by Carol Anderson, because what they do in these 2 essays is discuss the well-meaning white person and why that's unhelpful when we're looking at racial justice. And as someone who likes to think of myself as racially conscious, that pointed out flaws in my own kind of interactions with people that was unhelpful to kind of striving for the equity and justice that I think this country needs. And just hearing different perspectives of people is, I think, really important as well. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, we all know Jesmyn Ward is a fantastically talented writer.
Right.
And Beth Knapp talked about her. I've taught her, and I actually learned about her from Brian in my first year of teaching. Salvage the Bones, another book that you talked about.
Yeah.
Ugly Cry.
I ugly cried on the beach in Guadalupe with Miss Carper sitting next to me we were on vacation for spring break. Not last year because that was COVID, so the year before. And she looked over at me and I was ugly crying and she had, no idea what was going on. I was like, the ending is not what I wanted, but it was so good.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's amazing that a piece of art or fiction or, nonfiction can move you in that way. And I think teaching at Gilman, it gives you the opportunity to be moved in those different ways pretty much every day. And that's what I appreciate about this school and kind of working here. And even, learning things from my students who are 16 years old, they bring things up all the time, every day that I didn't think about that make me react in similar ways.
I learn things from my kids every day, so yeah, that's fun.
So Gilman School, what is it about this place that keeps you motivated and wanting to come into the classroom every day?
I love the people I work with. I love the kids that I teach. I love that I am encouraged to be curious myself. I'm not expected to be the expert, and I don't want to be the expert. So it's fun to work with kids and not just tell kids things. I love the teacher coach model. I love coaching. I think it's one of my favorite parts of the day. It can kind of, switch gears a little bit and, do something a little different. I think that Gilman just does really special things for kids. I think it allows them to hone the skills they already have and also pick up new things and question preconceived notions and allow them to the space and the security to explore things in a way that like maybe they're dismantling something that they've thought was always true, and they're not going to get in trouble for that. So
in your classes and the classes that you teach, what is like I'm interested in, like, maybe what do you emphasize in your classes? Like, what do you want your students to come away from Miss Lloyd's class and enter the next year with, whether that be skills or ways of looking at the world, or minor things? Like, what do you kind of emphasize for your full year as a teacher?
Yeah, so I think skill-wise, I want people to ask questions, and additionally, I want them to kind of take the initiative to research themselves, right? Like, we live in an age where you can pull anything up on your phone, right? So ask a question, do the research, and then interrogate the answers you've been given, right? Don't take everything at face value. I don't want them to be like these kind of jaded skeptics, but I also don't want them to like just kind of allow things into their brain that like maybe doesn't deserve that space, doesn't deserve to live there rent free, right? I think, thematically, I emphasize this idea of global citizenship a lot. My high school was really big on that because Walter H. Annenberg, who was an ambassador for the United States, actually graduated from my high school. And so his whole thing was that you were supposed to strive for the highest quality of citizenship. And so I kind of adapted that to global citizenship. And what that really means is like, you're not the center of the universe and you should be okay with that. And in being okay with that, you're also like called on to be good and to be kind and to uplift others. And so I hope that what kids are getting from me is like, it's okay for you not to be the center of everything. In fact, you shouldn't be, because there are things that you could be doing for others that will benefit everybody at the end.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Global citizenship and just that wider net of perception outside of yourself.
Right.
And I think this is something else that I think everyone should watch. And even kids in my class said everyone should watch this after I showed it to them, is David Foster Wallace's Kenyon, This is Water speech. I think that was 2005. But his message is the same thing. It's really global citizenship, or just thinking outside of yourself. Right. And catching yourself when you are. Because we all are. Like, I'm thinking about, what am I going to eat for dinner tonight? Or how am I going to get home in the snow?
Right.
Or the past, like, why did I screw up on that test? Why did I say 3 times 5 minutes ago? Why did, right? And it's easy to get caught up in the web of the future and the past, and you're missing out on the situation that we're in right here and thinking about other people, really. Exactly your message. So I think that's really, I just want
kids to be, like, I want people to be reflexive, right? Like think about yourself, and then think about how thinking about yourself is, unhelpful, right?
It's the default setting.
Right. It's absolutely the default setting. I think humans are innately selfish in that regard, but like, take a moment, don't think about yourself, think about other people, and then use your ability to think about yourself to help others.
I think in the speech, he gives such a great example that I experienced on my own this morning, which I was thinking a lot about the speech anyway, so I'm glad this happened. But like, I'm at Eddie's and I'm just getting one item, and it's like 7:30 in the morning before I saw you at Starbucks. And the person in front of me had she went shopping this morning. She had a whole buggy of stuff, and I was right behind her, and I was like, I've got a department meeting right now. Like, let's go. Just let me go ahead of you and I'll get out of here. But she didn't, and that's fine, because I had the David Foster Wallace speech in my head, and I think that's just an important thing to carry with us.
Right.
Because it's not always about you. She might have something else to do, and she's got to get out of there, and she's got to feed a family. I don't know what she's dealing with. So
reminding yourself that when you see people, you're really only seeing a snippet of who they are, right? And so, like, jumping to conclusions is something I'm guilty of, but something I'm working on.
Yep, we're all working on it. But Sarah Lloyd, it was a pleasure to get you on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
We have a lot more to talk about, but we'll save it for some better weather. Hopefully, it's pouring snow out there, so everyone get home safe, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.